Designing a fantasy world is a very unique experience. The crux of designing your world comes down to one simple factor. What do you want in your world? As an author, as a world builder, you have the right to put whatever you want in that story. Unless you're adding something that contradicts an already established world, pretty much anything is fair game. To use a controversial example to explain what I mean by an established world, let's look at Star Wars and the desire for an evil empire. A New Hope didn't have to establish how Palpatine came into power because we were starting on a fresh canvas. Make no mistake, establishing how he did isn't a bad thing. The sequel trilogy, on the other hand, needed to explain how Snoke came into power because we were working with an established world. Whether or not it succeeded is not the point of this video. It's just an example. My point is that when you're creating a world from scratch, you're allowed to have whatever you want in it. But that doesn't mean you can just throw in whatever you want with no thought when world building a culture, especially if you want others to accept it. When you make a world, if you want other people to see it and enjoy it, you need to take these additions you want to a certain extreme in order to make your world believable. And if you enjoy what you're doing, this can be one of the best parts of writing. So good, there's a name for when you do too much of it: world builder's disease. With that in mind, let's go on to the reason you clicked on this video, the title. And for those of you wondering why I'm using my own creation instead of a more widely known and probably better for the YouTube algorithm example, that will become apparent in time. When I was writing my book, I say like I'm not still writing it, I was going through the power systems I wanted to include in the story. And one that really interested me was the concept of bloodline limits, or Kekai Genkai. Am I saying that right? In Naruto, as I understood them. The idea of a family having a genetic superpower was, quite frankly, something I wanted, so I put it in my story. Except this time, every family has a unique superpower of varying degrees of usefulness. Some people can teleport, and some people cannot talk. They just spit out fire that shapes the words they want to say. But then I was brought along to a dilemma. If every family has a power, then what about when children were produced? Because, you're not supposed to have children with family members. I didn't want that in my story. At this point, I made a biological adjustment. When two people have a child, it's essentially a flip of a coin as to which family they'll wind up with. And it was at that point that I decided that I needed to look at how this massive difference in genetics would change the world on a sociological level. The one that was most obvious is the fact that, at least for many people, only one of their parents would actually be someone in their family, and any siblings might not even be in their family. This doesn't mean they dislike their other parent. It simply means that objectively, one of their parents, one side of their family, would understand them far more than the other. A child who can see everything for miles and has to live with it is going to be far closer to the parent who has experienced it than they are to the parent who has vines for hair. Siblings who can transform their bodies are likely to be closer to each other than one who can take a lot of hits before being injured. And yes, these are all characters in my book. This can be a source for some interesting drama, especially in cultures that put far more emphasis on the connection of family powers than technical blood relation, which is even less obvious than it is in our world, because aside from a few genetic markers to indicate who your non-family parent is, they'd have as much shared genetics as I do with a Chinese person. But the other aspect this brought to mind was the idea that with this system in place, families exist as much more than just a name. They exist in the abilities they bring in the world. With this in mind, it only made sense to me that they'd want to keep their family power alive into the future. And because of other things I wanted in my story, death is far more likely in their world than it is in ours. Thus, I had created a world that highly valued having biological children. As someone from Africa, I found it a little similar to how some societies in the past valued having a lot of children to help in farm work, especially when you consider that the mortality rate was significantly higher than it is now. It's not exactly the same, but it's similar. So the culture essentially enforces that having biological children so that your family doesn't fade into history is a good thing, and on some level, a responsibility to those who came before you. And as with real life, different cultures take this to different extremes. Before I go on, I find it necessary to point out a few differences between our world and the one I created, specifically regarding women and people in the LGBT community. They weren't as oppressed or marginalized as they were in the history of our world, particularly because of the nature of the world they lived in would not allow it. With that out of the way, let's move on to examine the LGBT community in this world. People respect their choices, but there's an underlying societal value in having biological children. For some, if they have a big enough family, they don't have to worry about this. But others aren't so lucky. And it would be naive of me to not admit that there would absolutely be situations where they'd be given undue pressure to do so. But there are still those who, regardless of their attraction to members of the opposite sex, would see continuing their family as an honor. And so comes the concept of family partners, an agreement between two individuals who do not see themselves having children soon to have children for each other's families. The woman bears the children and the man has to support the woman until their agreement either runs out or they decide to cancel it. It must be noted that if the agreement doesn't state it beforehand, neither parent is obligated to take care of the child that is technically not theirs, though they do tend to still have relationships with these children. This can also apply to heterosexual people who aren't interested in finding romantic love but find it necessary to have children for whatever reason. As such, being a single parent isn't stigmatized. Conversely, certain people from certain cultures have no idea what an abortion is and would be horrified to hear it. And then I thought, wow, when medicine of this world advances to the point where artificial insemination is a thing, things will get a lot more interesting. And that's the story of how I built a massive underlying part of the social structure of my world because of a relatively minor power system I wanted to introduce. Do not get me started on the 3 or 4 other power systems and the way the unique nature of the world has completely reshaped the way humans live. One thing that really struck me about the system was the idea that it may be considered wrong. Would people who read the story find it immoral for a society to encourage people to have children? And then I decided that doesn't really matter, because it would be about as valid as an American criticizing the values and culture in my country. Because when it comes to world building, it's important to realize that no one is going to criticize their own culture as if another culture is watching them. To use our world as an example, any more utopian culture than our own may take the fact that humans hunt or have ever hunted as something horrific if they do not take into context how it was necessary for survival then, and even now maybe it's necessary to prevent the destruction of our environment. If you don't believe me, look up that time rabbits were eating Australia, which I will admit was totally humans' fault in the first place. In summary, a world builder can put whatever they want into their world, and is free to adjust it as they see fit. But it's in the unintended consequences that you didn't think of while first creating your world, but which only makes sense on inspection, that the idea can truly flourish. This is a topic that I could only really explore with my own creation, because as much as I try, I do not have a window into the thought processes of those who create other media. I can analyze what they create and even critique it. As my subscribers know, I am willing and able to do that. But this topic required intimate knowledge of how a simple concept became a massive part of its world sociology, and I thought, what's the smallest, least spoiler-filled concept in the story I'm writing? And here we are. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to leave a comment on your own thoughts, like if you enjoyed the video, and subscribe if you like more content like it. And if you're going to leave a dislike, please tell me why in the comments, otherwise I will see no value in it. Link to my Twitter in the description. Thank you and good night.
Please, you don't need to do this.
What's your name, boy?